Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Council on Animal Care's webinar on categories of welfare impact. My name is Sandra McInnes, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Communications here at the CCAC, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the CCAC office, located here in Ottawa, is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. Many of you are joining us from across Canada today, and we therefore take the time to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this home. As we gather today, let us keep in mind the 10 calls to action for natural scientists to enable reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Thank you. All right, so just a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded and it will be made available to everyone on the CCAC website, hopefully as of next week. We'll send an email around to let you know when it's been posted. You can also change your Zoom view between gallery or speaker on the top right-hand corner of the Zoom window. And because we are a very large group today, everyone is on mute, and we'll work to keep it that way unless someone is asking a question. There'll be plenty of opportunities for comments and questions throughout the session, as well as a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat feature, or if you'd like to ask your question out loud, please let us know in the chat or raise your hand by clicking on participants, and you'll be called upon to share your question. I'd like to now call upon Monsieur Pierre Zéro, Executive Director of the CCAC, to introduce our topic and speaker today. Pierre?
Thank you very much, Sandra. First, thank you very much, everybody, for being here today, and welcome to this session. The recently published CCAC guidelines, Categories of Welfare Impact, acknowledges that the welfare of animals used in science can be impacted in diverse ways and describe how expected welfare impact to animals should be determined and summarized into a descriptive category that will then be confirmed retrospectively. This session will explore the details of the new guidelines, their visions for improving animal welfare, and how they work together with other guidelines documents, including animal welfare assessment and endpoints. This will be followed by a general discussion and Q&A session. Leading the session today is Dr. Michael Walker. Mike obtained his PhD from University of Guelph in animal behavior and welfare. His graduate work concentrated on promoting reduction and refinement for laboratory mice to improve experimental design, as well as developing novel tools for assessing mouse motivation for various enrichment items. After graduation, he began working at the Canadian Council on Animal Care as a senior research analyst. More recently, he has been working at the CCAC as the Standards Development Director, developing guidelines and policies for the ethical care and use of animals in Canadian science. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Walker. Mike?
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Pierre. And thank you to everyone for attending today. It's really great and encouraging to see so many people coming out here for our first virtual learning webinar here in our upcoming series. And so like Pierre mentioned, today the talk is going to be about the new categories of welfare impact guidelines, but I'm also going to be giving you some information and demonstrating how this is integrating with some other recently published guidelines, specifically animal welfare assessment and the new endpoints guidelines. And so just to start off with an overview of what we're going to be doing today, again, we're going to be talking primarily about categories of welfare impact, or CAWI, their intended purpose, what they were designed to do, and how they integrate with these other documents to achieve a shared goal. And I know that some people are here looking for some hands-on examples or training, but we're not quite ready for that yet. And so that's not going to be my goal today, although I will come back to this at the end. So instead of getting really into the specifics of these documents, my goal today is to help everyone understand kind of the big picture of these documents and where these guidelines are leading the CCAC into the future. And really the goal here is a culture change, a big shift in the way that we think about animal use in science. And so through these policies and guidelines, we're attempting to shift the focus away from the scientific procedures performed on animals and instead towards a better understanding of how the animals are experiencing the world in which they live and the events that impact them. And this change is going to be pervasive across documents moving forward, including upcoming guidelines, any policy revisions, and our planned upcoming new ethics principles. And this is really a values-driven change here in the way that we treat and think about animals. And it's really a statement about that animals aren't tools or technologies, but they have lives that matter to them. And this is really important. And this is a huge change that I personally am really excited about moving forward in Canadian science and this different way of thinking about animals, and that this will have a huge impact that's really to the betterment of these animals. And so just to kind of throw back here and explain a bit more about this big shift. So previously to the categories of welfare impact, I'm sure everyone knows we've had the categories of invasiveness in animal experiments for a little over 30 years. This has been kind of the model and the framework that we've been using here in Canada. And really the shift away from this categories of invasiveness towards the categories of welfare impact was needed because our understanding has changed over the past 30 years. We know so much more now than we did back then. And really there's kind of two main reasons that that the shift to the focus on animal experience away from the procedures being performed on them. And the first is that not all animals are going to experience all of the procedures in the same way, even things that may seem benign. So for example, I'm just going to blow this up here. This is from the old document. There's some text here. So in category of invasiveness B, for example, it lists a whole bunch of example procedures that would land some animals in a category B. And so, for example, here, one of them is the short-term and skillful restraint of animals for purposes of observation or physical examination. But if you think about it, is handling all animals the same? Like all species perceive handling the same way? Do young animals and adults perceive that the same way? And I think that everyone who's worked with animals will say no. Handling animals is different. And different species, different ages. There's so many factors that can impact how animals experience being handled. And even this is a bit of like a personal experience, but even within mice, laboratory mice, there are strong strain differences that are very apparent to anyone who's ever handled laboratory mice. Like they're just different. And another example here, the next one on the list is blood sampling. And maybe blood sampling, this is another kind of a different example, but if blood sampling is kind of benign and one blood sample is no big deal and there's not a lot of discomfort the first time, but what about if you do this 5 times, 10 times, or 20 times to a single animal? Does that change the impact that procedure has? Like probably yes. And what if instead we do something to reduce that impact? So what if we give them rewards after they have blood taken or train them through sham procedures? Like, does that change how the animals are experiencing having blood taken from them? And the second reason for the big shift is that animals used in science have their welfare affected by more things than just the procedures done to them. As we're going to talk about in the future, there are a lot of different ways that animal welfare is impacted that their life is not just the procedure, right? They're living in a scientific environment. They're living in, you know, for mice, for example, like in a cage, in a social group. Like there's so many things that can affect their experience, and that their life is different. It's not just, you know, the science being done to them. And so really this idea of the categories of welfare impact is a new concept to kind of capture what is happening to animals in scientific settings, as opposed to this previous focus, which was just on the procedures, primarily on the procedures being done to them. And that's the reason for our new focus here on animal welfare. And so what do I mean when we talk about animal welfare? Well, animal welfare is a concept that's used to characterize the physical and mental state of an individual animal and how this animal is experiencing the conditions in which it lives. And so welfare is about more than just being healthy or having a healthy animal, although that is an important component of it. And it goes a bit beyond that. And the other thing is that I just want to stress right now is that animal welfare is not a concept that is applied to kind of groups or populations of animals. So we might talk about the welfare of a group of animals, but really we're talking about the state of kind of the collective state of individuals within the group, not the group as a whole. And this idea of animal welfare is interesting because there's been a lot of progress made over the past, you know, couple decades in understanding how behavior and physiology can provide us information on how animals are actually experiencing their environment. In fact, there's an entire scientific discipline surrounding animal welfare, both to measuring the experiences of animals and making inferences about their internal states, but also to validating new methods to actually accurately measure this. And so we know so much more than we did in the past, and this continues to evolve, you know, as we move forward. And really the kind of maybe this is obvious, but I think it's important to state is that we really can't talk about animal welfare or draw any accurate conclusions about animal welfare, or even know if the things we're doing are improving animal welfare if we're not measuring it, if we don't have some way to actually put a value on it. And doing this in a scientific manner is really crucial. And so that's really where the categories of welfare impact come in. So in essence, they're a new framework for discussing animal welfare. So in order for us as a kind of collective group to have a standardized understanding of welfare, we need a framework or a scale to measure it. And that this is really the only way that we as a collective can have structured conversations about the concept. And so at its core, that's really what the categories of welfare impact are. They're this national framework that promotes a shared understanding of animal welfare and how different things can affect it for animals within science. And I'm going to come back to this, but I really want to stress that this measuring animal welfare is not a math equation. There isn't a validated way that we can just sum up you know, impacts in some kind of mathematical formula. It's really a judgment-based system. And I know some people we're probably going to talk about this at the end, and I know that this is frustrating, but that's kind of the current reality that we have. And so this is our best attempt to kind of structure those conversations, recognizing that judgments are still really important. And so the primary goals of the guidelines in general here are, one, to create awareness for protocol authors, so PIs, teachers, study directors, etc. Those people around the things that they are doing involving animals that are likely to impact the animal's welfare. The second goal is to help improve animal care committees' oversight around scientific activities. So it's the role of the animal care committee to kind of fully understand what is happening to animals and how those various activities can affect their welfare in order for them to make sound judgments about kind of the ethical acceptability of those scientific activities, and also to help them pinpoint areas for improvement. And finally, we're hoping that this structured framework can help improve communication between those protocol authors and animal care committees so that everyone can kind of collaboratively understand and improve animal welfare. And I know that when we've showed this before, it seems really overwhelming, but the idea of the framework is that it's supposed to help break down the idea, like what is animal welfare? Well, it's so nebulous, but by breaking it down into more manageable pieces, we're hoping that it's not so overwhelming for people to kind of start to wrap their head around. And so today, I'm gonna talk about some examples, and I thought to structure the talk here, I'm going to do kind of like a walkthrough of a scientific activity or a protocol. I'm going to break it down into 3 parts. So there's kind of the prospective part where the protocols it's in the planning and writing stage and the ACC review stage. So before the scientific activity is happening, we're going to talk a bit about how all these documents can be used while the scientific activity is happening. So concurrently with the scientific activity, and then what the retrospective component or what kind of reflection afterwards we're looking for, and what is the benefit of doing it that way. And so it starts obviously with writing a protocol and having that reviewed by the Animal Care Committee. And so this prospective process within the categories of welfare impact, this is what most of the guidelines document talks about. I think it's maybe the most complicated aspect of it. And so we're going to spend the most time today talking about this. But broadly speaking, there are kind of 3 main areas that have an impact on an animal's welfare during a scientific activity. So there's the attributes of the environment where the animal lives, there's the attributes of the animals themselves, and then the attributes of the scientific procedures performed on animals. And so within these 3 kind of large headings, we've identified, and the guidelines contain 16 different factors that should be considered prospectively as potential ways that an animal's welfare can be impacted. And so again, like this is all in the document. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over this, but within these, this is kind of the breakdown that the guidelines have. So within the attributes of the environment, there's obviously the housing and husbandry of the animal. And then also to be considered here is any kind of transportation or relocation of animals. For the attributes of the animals, we're thinking about things like their species, strain, or sex, their age, whether or not they're domesticated or not, their inherent welfare status, which refers to kind of any welfare compromises that they may have before before the scientific activity begins. So, for example, if they're like a genetic mutant or they have some kind of disease phenotype before anything actually happens to them, that's where that kind of thing would be considered. Their energy status or body condition, if there's something specific going on there. Social disruption refers to any kind of social animals and the groups in which they live, and thinking about aspects of that might impact their welfare. Their previous experiences, like this is their cumulative impact. So for animals that may have been used in more than one activity, or for animals that are involved in very long-term activities, this is kind of where those things would be thought about. And then known aspects of individuals. So this would pertain primarily to, larger, long-lived animals that maybe technicians or researchers may have worked with over a number of years, and would kind of know about individual temperaments. Things like maybe dogs, primates, maybe some farm animals, that kind of situation. When we start thinking about attributes of the scientific procedures, again, there's like a number of things to think about here. So number 1, the biggest one, obviously the procedure being done to the animal, that's very important. But there's additional things that we want to think about, such as the monitoring of the animal, both the method of monitoring and whether or not that has an impact on the animal itself, and then also kind of the rigorousness of the monitoring and its ability to kind of capture welfare impacts early, or if we're not monitoring very much, there's a chance that we might miss something and it drags on for a while. So think about that here, the method of killing animals, if that's involved in the study, the setting where the activity is taking place, is it in a controlled environment, or is it, for example, in a home out in the wild, something that might present additional challenges. We were asking people to think about the skill and experience of the personnel performing the procedures. You know, we have an expectation of competence, but that being said, I think, you know, we can all acknowledge that there are different skill levels, and some of these procedures are very technical and complicated, and that some people will be better at doing these than others. And then finally, any animal training or habituation that can be performed to kind of ease the animal into those procedures. So these are all things that, for the most part, are probably already described in some manner within an animal use protocol. Most of these will be, I think maybe there's a couple of things that, you know, moving on to the future, we might have to look at adding to protocols specifically. But for the most part, this information is already in animal use protocols. And you can look on the website, there's an FAQ associated with the COWI guidelines that provides a bit of a map for like where these factors came from in terms of other CCAC guidelines and kind of pre-existing expectations for review. So additional information about each one of these things is described within the categories of welfare impact document. So it tries to provide kind of a 1 or 2 paragraph summary of information to kind of explain what each of these factors is about and how you might start to go about scoring it. And so that's kind of a good place to start. And then more information can be found about some of these things in other CCAC guidelines as well. So the animal type guidelines will contain more information, for example, about different animals. So the mouse guidelines will have information about mouse housing, for example, or mouse husbandry. And so there's additional information depending on what animals you're working with that can be found in there. And some of this information will also be found in other kind of our general series of guidelines. So if we're looking at, for example, method of killing, like you can go and look at our euthanasia guidelines and get some more information about that one there as well. And so I've put a few in bold here. I'm going to show you. So I've selected one from each category just to give an example. And we're going to walk through these just to give an example of some things to think about or what the process might be when you're trying to evaluate these different factors. And so before we move on, though, I do want to stress one point, is that because this process is focused on the experiences of individual animals, if there are different subgroups of animals within a single protocol that might experience different levels of welfare impact, each group has to be assigned an appropriate category. So as many categories are required, should be used to describe the experiences of those animals within the protocol. There isn't going to be a rule like there was in the past where we would just assign all of the animals in the protocol to the highest category experienced by any one individual. That is no longer the case, and we're asking for as many kind of categories as appropriate, depending on what the animals will experience within a single protocol. And so, well, how will we start this framework and thinking about the impacts that all these different factors will have? So this is, again, from the guideline, evaluating each factor using this table. And we're trying to get, really, there's kind of 2 factors here to think about in terms of each one of those things. So there's the severity of the impact. Is that low, medium, or high? And I will say, I guess there is category A, positive impact. We'll touch on this a bit later. This may not be appropriate for all situations, but it does have a place within the framework broadly. So if we're thinking about negative impacts, from low to high, and then there's a time component. So either the frequency or duration of that impact, whichever thing is more relevant. So again, this will be, you'll have to make a bit of a choice. So for example, something like blood draws, well, it's probably the frequency of the blood draws that's more important than the duration of an individual needle poke. And again, I think this will be more obvious if you think about the context of your specific situation that you can evaluate, and you can pick whichever one of these time components is most relevant. And so again, this idea here from low to high severity and then low high frequency or duration, or short to long, whichever is appropriate. There have been some questions in the past saying, well, this is really hard. And this is really where the judgment comes in that I alluded to before. It is a judgment-based system. There is no set amount of time, for example, that makes something long, or a set amount of severity in all cases that will make something high. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And we recognize that this is challenging. And I'm going to come back to this again later on, but we do have a solution for this. But really, if you think about it, that there's different institutions have different situations. There's different cultures within institutions. There's different types of scientific animal use between institutions, different animals, different models. And there's so much variation across Canada that it makes it really challenging for us to provide very specific rules about what might fall into each of these categories. And so there is a need to make some judgments here, and that's okay. We're fairly confident that between the protocol authors, the veterinarians, and the rest of the animal care committees, the members of the animal care committee, that people can come to reasonable conclusions here. And as I will get to later on, this will improve over time. And so I think that I just want to stress, it's not that the CCAC has some answers that we're holding back, and we're just forcing institutions to say, oh, you figure it out, and then we'll tell you if you matched our answer or not. It's not. That's not really the case. Is that we can't provide something that will be effective for everyone, and that we don't want to provide something that everyone just copies and it's not actually useful in practice. So by asking institutions to work on this and maybe struggle through this at first, I think we're pretty confident that at the end, you'll get something that works well for your situation, even if it's a bit more challenging up front. And so that's kind of the thought process here. And again, I'm going to come back to this idea of improvement over time later on. So if we just move on, I want to give some examples. So of what you might do when evaluating a factor, for example. So in this case, I've pulled up housing and husbandry and just pulled up a list of questions or things that someone might want to think about when they're trying to understand the expected welfare impact of housing an animal for science. So if we know that that holding animals in scientific settings has a negative impact on their welfare, but we want to say, well, how much of a negative impact is that? And again, it depends. And there's so many things that we can think about here. So we can think, well, what is the amount of enrichment being provided to animals? So enrichment, things that go beyond the basics. And the idea here is that if there's more enrichment, the housing has a smaller negative impact. If we think about whether or not animals have been desensitized to husbandry procedures, such as basic handling, health inspections, cage changes, etc. Has there been any kind of positive reinforcement training through that? Are the animals pretty used to it? What impact do we think that will have on them? We can think about how long the animals are being held for. Are they there for only a week? Are they there for a year? And again, these will have this is a different impact. Again, if you think about if we're thinking about mice versus non-human primates. So what is long for a mouse, maybe not that long for a primate. And so again, there is still judgment required here. But we're hoping that this document, and then also the animal types documents, guidelines documents, can really help kind of provide some information and some food for thought. And for this factor specifically, we've suggested that it might be helpful to kind of assign preliminary scores for this factor based on the institution's SOP for housing, and saying if nothing deviates from this SOP, we would expect this welfare impact. Again, it's probably graded or something based on time, but that's maybe a good place to start, and to start thinking about it, and then start thinking about, well, what do deviations from that look like? And what are some ways that either animal welfare impact might go up or down, depending on the specific scientific activity? If we look at Another example, social disruption. So again, this is only for social species, which is most of the animals used in science, but not all. And so if it's the animal in question is not a social animal and is not housed socially, I think that we can just you can just skip this one as being not applicable. It doesn't make sense to really think about this in that context. But if they are social animals, then we're asking questions about what is the social experience of the animals? Are they being kept in social groups? If they are being kept in those groups, are those groups stable? If not, how often are those groups disrupted? And do we expect any negative outcomes for those disruptions, such as increased aggression? And so again, we would kind of sit there with our table, our severity, and our, in this case, maybe frequency of we would think about the frequency of the disruptions and say, and try and assign a score, a relative score for those animals. And if we say, hey, you know, we think we're pretty good on this one. Animals are being kept in stable social groups with no signs of social stress. You know, this factor we're suggesting should be scored as neutral. And I'm going to come back to this idea of neutral and not applicable in a second, but the idea here is that a neutral score is just saying it just doesn't have an impact on the animal's welfare. And in this case, we're saying that keeping them in social groups is not something that's seen as a positive. It's the expected scenario, and that anything else is seen as a negative. And then if we I moved on to just a third example, if we talk about training or habituation. So the idea behind this one is saying that animals can be habituated to procedures or trained through positive reinforcement to actively participate in a procedure as a way of lowering the welfare impact that procedure has on the animal. And so in this case, if animals have been trained or actively kind of choose to participate within a procedure for a reward, we would say, hey, this is really good. We think that this has a positive impact on their welfare and can serve to kind of reduce the impact that that procedure might have on them. And so we could assign this an A, for example. And if there is no training, the animals aren't trained at all, you know, they just go through the procedure, then we would say this factor is just not applicable. There's no training provided. It just doesn't make sense to really talk about here. And so just to maybe diffuse this one a little bit, I think maybe it's a bit confusing, and hopefully this will help. So when we think about kind of this idea of neutral and not applicable, I just want to explain briefly what we mean by that. And so not applicable are things that are just not present within a scientific activity. And so they're things that just don't even make sense to talk about or to consider. So for example, here, we have a factor method of killing, but if the animals aren't going to be killed at the end of the activity or as part of the activity, it just doesn't make sense to even think about the welfare impact because it just doesn't exist. It's just not a thing that's relevant to that specific scientific activity. On the other hand, if we're saying things are neutral, those are for factors that are present within the scientific activity, but we just don't think they have a real impact on the welfare of the animals. And so those are things that are considered, they're relevant, but we've determined that they just don't have an expected welfare impact. So for example, if we're thinking about the age and developmental stage of animals factor, and we have this homogeneous group of adult animals and there's no special concerns about them, then we just think, well, that doesn't really have any impact on their expected impact on their welfare. And the outcome is still the same. So both cases, the factors just wouldn't be scored, but the process and the kind of the thought process to get there is slightly different. And I just want to acknowledge that, and I hope that maybe clears that up or makes a bit more sense. And so after going through all of the 16 factors and at least kind of checking them off or thinking about them, what we're going to get is essentially a report card at the end. And I want to stress that this is really the heart of categories of welfare impact. This is the most important part. So if you take one thing away from this talk today, I hope it's this kind of report card approach, which is a way to kind of summarize all the impacts that are expected to happen to an animal across the scientific activity. And the best part of this is that it shows you where the largest welfare impacts are expected to occur, and allows ACCs and protocol authors to kind of target those areas in a risk-based way, where you can spend, your time budget or whatever you want to think about, focusing on those areas that can make the most difference to the welfare of those animals. So we look for those highest welfare impacts and how can we reduce those, rather than maybe focusing on things that already have a pretty small impact. And so, for example, I've just put this up. This is not a specific study or anything. I've just filled in letters so that I can show you some examples. But if we look at this outcome report card here, and we say, wow, the scientific procedures, man, that's an E. Like, oof, maybe what can we do? What can we do to reduce this? Can we make any refinements to this procedure? We can also look and say, well, what if, we can't really refine the procedure, but is there any way we can habituate the animals using a sham procedure, or train them with rewards? Is there something we can do to maybe make this a bit easier on those animals? Or if we look and say, we're looking at, the skill and the experience of the personnel, okay, that's not so bad, it's a C, but can we get someone with more experience to come and do this procedure, someone who's more expert? Can we get, or if not, can we get them to supervise, maybe a trainee, for example, more closely, or some way that we can look at this and say, what can we do to reduce the welfare impacts on the animal? Maybe this person just needs a bit more training. Similarly, if we look and we say D, the inherent welfare status of the animal, that's pretty high welfare impact, but that's the model we have. That's what we have to use. Maybe there's nothing we can do about it. But where can we look elsewhere in the life of this animal? Is there something within the housing? How can we add more enrichments? Can we improve the experience of this animal in other ways if there's nothing we can do about some of these factors? And so really, this is kind of the goal here, is to look at this across kind of all these factors summarized here in some kind of table or report card like this, and really allows you to target in on areas of the most concern and spend your time improving animal welfare kind of effectively. And so that's kind of the heart of it, but we do want to recognize that there is this kind of summation of effects on an animal's welfare. So it's not each one of these things individually, but all of those factors combined to be kind of the experience of the animal. And how do we recognize that? And so we're suggesting that these kind of scores are combined within factors and then across factors into an overall score, for the scientific activity. Again, this is not like a perfect thing, a perfect math like equation, but what we're suggesting here is that the weighting of the letter scores be kind of exponential, so that higher welfare impacts, so those Ds and Es, have this kind of disproportionately more impact on the combined scores in terms of what the animal's experience is. And so this tool that we've put on the website will do this for you. And I think in this kind of contrived example here, it's given us a D. And I think it's really useful to understand how the different impacts across all these factors might sum up. And it's helpful to discuss the overall impact that a protocol has on an animal. But really, I do want to stress again that the line by line is really the crucial bit of information with respect to kind of improving animal welfare within this study. And so I also want to say that this tool shows how these higher letters across the factors carry more weight. So there's not just an even average, the higher letters are worth more. But it's really meant to be a guide, this tool. It's not perfect. It doesn't fit all situations perfectly. It's just meant to be kind of a starting place and a guide, and not a decision maker. I do want to stress that a lot. Because this welfare impact system isn't math-based, obviously we've had to make a tool that is math-based to kind of help, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And it is a judgment-based system, and it does rely on the protocol author and the animal care committee kind of coming together to decide on a final letter. And if you're using this tool and something looks off, you can let us know, and maybe it's a mistake that we've made with a tool, but maybe something is just wrong, and maybe it doesn't jive with a decision, the kind of the judgment, collective judgment of your local animal care committee, and that's fine. You are the correct, your decision is the correct decision, not just the number that gets spit out by, or the letter that gets spit out by the tool. And so it's very possible that some things on this table here are just so impactful that they need even more weight than the tool is currently giving them. It's really hard to make something like this that will work in all situations. So again, this is meant to be like a starting place. It might be helpful for you, especially starting out. And over time, maybe this will just, you won't need this anymore. You'll be so good at assigning categories of welfare impact. You're just better than any kind of tool that we can produce. So I hope that this is helpful. And again, this is something that we'll look at over time, and hopefully we can refine as people start to use it. And so I do want to quickly switch gears a little bit to talking about some of these other documents that I mentioned. In this case, looking at both scientific endpoints and humane intervention points, and how that might integrate with our COWI framework here. And so I hope that this is a little bit obvious, but if we're part of the endpoints guidelines, they talk about before starting the scientific activity, you got to choose your endpoints, you got to choose your humane intervention points, and develop the monitoring regime. So that's an expectation from those guidelines, but it slots perfectly into what the categories of welfare impact framework here is talking about within these factors. So the scientific procedures, if we're thinking about the endpoints, maybe, can the scientific endpoints be earlier to reduce the impact to the animals? And then for the humane intervention points is saying, how can we intervene more effectively? Do we need to intervene sooner? Are there things that we can do to reduce the welfare impact to the animals through our humane interventions? In terms of the monitoring and developing the animal monitoring regime is asking questions like, do we need to monitor the animals more? Do we need to monitor them more at certain time points, but not others? And how can we do this monitoring in the kind of least invasive manner that doesn't have an impact on the animals? And again, so those things integrate quite well within our framework and just give you additional things to think about when you're scoring on the categories of welfare impact. Likewise, when we're thinking about this idea of cumulative endpoints, which is new, but fits well within, I think, what animal care committees would do anyways, thinking about, limits on long-term use of animals or repeated use of animals. And again, this fits in with our 2.7 here, previous experience of the animals or their cumulative lifetime experiences. And this is the cumulative endpoints chapter within the endpoints guidelines, gives a lot of good information and a lot of kind of good questions to ask, thinking about this kind of long-term use of animals. So even asking questions like, is the animal done, or does it need a rest period? Can they continue to be used at all, or should they be retired? And I think there's a lot more to it within that document, but it gives a lot of information to think about that can be used to inform how this factor would be scored. And so we're going to move on. So that's kind of our prospective kind of planning phase of our scientific activity. And so if we think about during the scientific activity, what are the kind of key components of this? And really, this is where animal welfare assessment kicks in and is really the kind of key aspect and the key player for this part of the process. So the animal welfare assessment has some guideline statements that I've put here. The first one here is about setting up a process that involves a team approach completed by protocol authors, veterinarians, animal care personnel, etc. And it should draw on information gathered through research, veterinary and husbandry activities. And the other one, guideline 3 here, is saying that welfare assessments must be performed regularly for all animals. The assessments should take into account the physical condition, the psychological well-being, and the impact of experimental procedures. And when known, the cumulative lifetime experiences and environmental parameters should also be included in the assessment. And again, hopefully you can see some parallels here with what we were asking for in the categories of welfare impact guidelines. And so we know the cumulative lifetime experience of these animals because we've already talked about it, and we've already looked at the environmental parameters that the animals will live in because we've planned through the COWI framework to address that as well. And again, I'm going to come back to this at the end, but I do just want to highlight here that these are shared requirements between documents that don't have to be duplicated. They just have to be integrated with each other. So you don't have to have one process for COWI and one process for welfare assessment kind of running in silos within your institution, but look for ways that they harmonize together and you can kind of do both objectives with one process. And so if we look at the welfare assessment, this is again a summary diagram from the guidelines document that just kind of describes how welfare assessments, their general flow, how should they happen. There's a welfare assessment initiation trigger. We do our assessment. It's based on, primarily animal-based indicators, ideally. We look and see, are there any welfare concerns? If there are, we need to alert somebody, and then we need to address them. And if we look at what is required within the endpoints guidelines in terms of humane intervention points, it talks about monitoring animals as they progress through the scientific activity, applying interventions as required, adapting the endpoints as needed in terms of unexpected outcomes, and keeping records. And so again, there's a lot of overlap here between these two programs, even though they aren't exactly the same thing, but applying humane intervention points fits within the broader animal welfare assessment expectations. And so monitoring humane intervention points is like a really good thing to be part of an animal welfare assessment. And I do want to stress that you have to be measuring the welfare of the animals to actually achieve any of this. So if we look at some specific overlaps, well, the welfare assessment asks you to do some animal-based indicators. Well, that mirrors perfectly with monitoring the animals as they progress through the scientific activity. If we look at down here, some actions, so where we want people to address any welfare concerns that arise. Well, this is exactly the same thing as applying these humane intervention points when animals need some support as they progress through a scientific activity. In the same way that record keeping and reporting, to the relevant authority, the animal care committee or the veterinarian or whoever needs to know, is also an expectation of both of these documents. And really the core of both of these things is that during the scientific activity, we have eyes on the animals. We are watching the animals. We're evaluating the animals. We're not just checking off a list of procedures. And so the most crucial point is that we're focusing on the welfare of the animals and intervening as necessary to help them, not just monitoring for the sake of monitoring. So we know what we're doing during the scientific activity. We're looking after animals. We're keeping an eye on them and monitoring their welfare. And what do we do at the scientific activity is over? So in terms of the categories of welfare impact, there is an expectation that there's a retrospective evaluation based on that report card that you predicted. And afterwards, it's time to say, well, how good was our prediction? Did what we predicted, did that actually happen? Were those actually the impacts? And that there's an expectation then that those scores are adjusted up and down based on what actually happened to the animals, which because you've been doing welfare assessments and monitoring humane intervention points throughout the study. So if we look here, we take our report card. This is the same one. And I've just, again, made some kind of maybe silly examples, but just to show you what we mean and how things can change. So in this case, let's say we had our relocation and transportation. We predicted B. We thought, hey, we got to move, our room is only available for a month, and then we have to move animals across campus to another facility. It's not a big deal, but it's something that we wanted to recognize. But when you actually got down to it, your room became available. You didn't end up having to move the animals at all. It just became a not applicable factor. Well, awesome, great. So we can just cross off B and change that to a dash or a not applicable. In other cases, we might think about the scientific procedure. So we knew that we guessed E. We thought, ooh, that's pretty serious. Maybe this was a precautionary E. And it turns out that, because we were monitoring the welfare of the animals, things weren't actually quite as severe as we expected them to be, or maybe the scientific activity, and we were able to end sooner, so it didn't get to a point of E, and we would just downgrade this retrospectively to a D based on what we know happened during the activity. And so things may in this case, they can improve over what we predicted. And in other cases, maybe we would say, oh, things got worse. So if we looked at the social experience of the animals here, we've put C, but it turns out that there was a lot more fighting than we expected when the animals were returned to the group after we performed the procedure on them, and that was a lot worse than we actually expected it to be. And so in that case, we've increased this to a D. And so that's it. That's the retrospective confirmation process. It's just to look at what you predicted and look for ways based on what actually happened that the score needs to be adjusted. And so this is mirrored within the other two guidelines documents as well. So within the endpoints guidelines document, there's this expectation here where people are asked to evaluate the effectiveness of both their scientific endpoints and their humane intervention points, and then looking at how they can use that information in the future. So asking questions like, were the interventions successful at restoring or protecting the welfare of the animals? Do we need to intervene sooner? Do we need to try a different intervention? And we would know this because we were looking at the welfare of the animals throughout this time. And we would say, did the welfare of the animals improve as a result of this intervention? Yes or no? Or did the animals get their interventions at the correct time points? Do we need to change how we were delivering those? We can also look at how the chosen interventions can be refined for next time, either the interventions themselves or the time at which they're delivered. So asking, for example, like a question, was our analgesia effective? Did we get the correct drug and dose for these animals? Do we need to try something else? Can we use non-pharmacological tools in addition to our analgesia? What are ways that we can do better next time? Similarly, within the animal welfare assessment guidelines document, it talks about a retrospective analysis. So guideline 5 says the animal care committee should use welfare assessment summaries to identify systemic welfare risks, anticipate welfare implications, and inform future decisions about the use of animals. And so these kind of welfare assessment records can really, again, we think, be helpful and useful in maybe identifying things that you may not otherwise notice. So it can help to identify reoccurring issues in specific facilities. If, for example, one building is always having more welfare problems than another one, maybe there's something wrong with some of the facilities, some of the airflow or something. It can look at triggering a reevaluation of a husbandry SOP, like maybe everyone's following this SOP, but we're still not getting great welfare outcomes. How can we improve our SOP? And it might also help indicate when additional training or a different training program is needed. And so I hope throughout this thing here, you've kind of seen that there's this cyclical pattern across all three guidelines, and this is really important. So the goal of all of this is to be a continuous learning process for both protocol authors and animal care committee members. And this is the core philosophy of all of these documents and this approach moving forward, is this idea of continuous improvement using an iterative approach over time. So we start with our prospective planning phase, where we're predicting welfare impacts, we're planning out our intervention points and our endpoints, we're setting up our welfare assessment schemes, which feeds into what we're doing concurrently with the scientific activity. We're collecting data, we're looking at the animals, we're assessing their welfare, we're intervening as necessary to protect their welfare. And then retrospectively, we're reevaluating our predictions and our plans for interventions. We're adjusting them as necessary, and then we're incorporating those into our plans for next time, which will hopefully kind of, there's this model of continuous improvement, right? Where we're learning from things that we've done in the past in a more structured approach. And so these, in summary, these new national standards, these kind of 3 documents, and as well as, future documents coming out of the CCAC, are really moving away from focusing only on the procedures performed on animals, and instead promoting this kind of more holistic focus on the experiences of individual animals. And we think that this is a really important step and shift in the culture of animal use within Canada. And so in summary today, we've talked about the shift, again, as I just mentioned, away from focusing on procedures towards the experiences of the animals. We've looked at how the categories of welfare impact can be used to predict the welfare impacts to animals and identify areas of improvement and a way to focus on those things that are most impactful to animals. We've looked at how planning for both cumulative endpoints and humane intervention points fits within the COWI framework. We've looked at how assessing the welfare of the animals during scientific activities is crucial to understanding their experiences, and how the application of humane intervention points can fit within the welfare assessment idea. And we've talked about this iterative approach that leads to continuous improvements in animal welfare and our understanding of animal welfare and the impacts that scientific activities have on animals across all of the documents. And I do, again, just want to focus on this idea of integration across documents, in that all 3 of these guidelines share a common goal of improving animal welfare, and that many of the requirements from these documents can overlap and integrate with each other within institutional processes. So from the CCAC perspective, institutions can satisfy multiple guidelines requirements at the same time through the same processes within your institution in a way that works for you. So they don't need to be 3 independent processes to meet each of these 3 guidelines. And you can also think about ways that they might be integrated as appropriate within other CCAC requirements, things like protocol renewal and your protocol renewal forms, daily health checks, and post-approval monitoring. These are just some examples. Again, you don't have to do any of this, but there are opportunities, I think, to kind of integrate this across existing processes that you're probably already doing within your institution. And finally, I just want to highlight some next steps. So this webinar, this is not the end. This is just the beginning of what the CCAC is kind of committed to doing in terms of rolling out the categories of welfare impact specifically. We've planned for a number of educational opportunities over the next 6 years. So for anyone who doesn't know, the implementation date set for the categories of welfare impact is not until 2030. So you still have 6 years to kind of figure everything out and start doing this within your institution. It doesn't need to happen immediately. And so some of these things that we've planned over the next 6 years, we have things, some future virtual Q&As, kind of like we're going to have now. We're hoping to put on some regional workshops. We're hoping to do some expert panel discussions, and that we're committed to a COWI session at each of our national workshops, again, over the next 5 or 6 years. So things are coming. The next one I want to highlight is the CCAC National Workshop in 2025 is at the end of April in Richmond, BC. And this one is going to have an in-person COWI workshop. And we're planning for this to be a bit more of a hands-on, looking at a protocol, trying to evaluate the COWI of a specific protocol within maybe kind of a small group approach, like something to mimic an animal care committee. And that's going to be the first time that we offer a specific kind of hands-on training like that. It probably won't be the last, but that's going to be something, for those of you who are interested, that'll be the next kind of opportunity to do something a bit more hands-on. In terms of animal welfare assessment, actually the next next part of our virtual learning series is going to be a webinar about animal welfare assessment. That's happening at the end of January, so coming up pretty soon. And this is going to be a webinar in both English and French, bringing on some guest speakers to talk about implementing animal welfare assessment within their institution. So this will be a bit more practical again, for those of you looking for that kind of information about how to do this within your institution. And hopefully those speakers can talk a bit about some challenges that they faced and ways that they overcame it in terms of navigating how this will work within their institution. And I also just want to end that there is ongoing discussions with both our assessment team and then the panels they bring when they come to visit your institutions over the next 6 years. Again, this will be kind of an ongoing learning process, both for us and for everyone else. So that's the end of my presentation, and I hope that helped. And I guess we have some time for some Q&A now.
Thanks so much, Mike. We can definitely open up for questions and comments. We already have quite a few here. So if anyone else has any more questions, you can use the chat feature located on the right side of your screen, or if you want to ask your question out loud, please let us know in the chat or raise your hand by clicking on participants. So Mike, the first question is the retrospective confirmation expected to be done at a renewal, or would this just be done at the completion of a study, at the closure?
Yeah, so I think the idea here is actually, again, we're still working on harmonizing this with the animal use data. And so I don't want to make any conclusions because we haven't finished that yet. But I think the idea here is that it would be done at renewal. So after, I think this also kind of harmonizes well with what the renewal process is currently about, where you have to kind of inform the ACC of like what you've done, were there any like deviations from what you expected, et cetera. So if we're doing this kind of retrospective approach at the time of renewal, I think it aligns well with that. And also it's more effective if the kind of iterative loop is done kind of annually as opposed to every 4 years, for example. And so there's a real opportunity to make improvements at the time of renewal rather than waiting, for example, if the protocol goes on for 4 years. So that would be what I would suggest. I think that would be the most effective kind of outcome there.
Great. This person works closely with fish, and it can be difficult to categorize work with them at various stages of their lives, especially very young development stages. For instance, if we're working on understanding temperature effects on hatch rate and survivability to free swimming stages, the baseline mortality can be up to 97%, simply as a function of fish ecology, i.e. only 3 to 5% of fish eggs actually make it to YOY stage in both the wild and the lab. It's really difficult to categorize projects like this. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I'm not really able to comment on specific situations. Like I personally don't really know anything about fish myself. So that's like really hard for me. But I think that this is something that two things come to mind. So one, if the best place to get information really to help with this is looking at our guidelines. So we have guidelines on zebrafish specifically, and then there are other guidelines on fish, and there can be some information. I think the fish guidelines are they're currently under revision. When they're published, there will be a section in all our new guidelines. So for the past 5 years now, all the new animal type guidelines have a section on welfare assessment. And so that will give some more specific advice for different animal types on welfare assessment for those animals. But of course, you are the expert in those animals. And so you, along with the animal care committee, need to kind of work through this framework and try to come to some kind of mutual understanding based on your own expertise. The other thing is that the categories of welfare impact aren't limiting. So if something is an E, then it's just an E, and it's not the categories of welfare impact aren't saying you can't do this. It's just a way to kind of accurately reflect what is happening in a way that the animal care committee can review that information and say, are we comfortable with this this activity taking place, given what we can see the impacts are. And so, maybe, what you described, maybe like, I don't want to make any judgments because I don't want to be held to this. And I don't know enough to like comment on your specific example myself, but hopefully that can give you a bit of a place to start and maybe a bit of a better understanding of what we're asking for. And I recognize that for some animals, we don't have guidelines for them, or the literature on animal welfare assessment is very limited for some certain species. And until we can do better, like, we're going to have to just kind of do our best. And I'm really hoping that this idea of the iterative approach will get us to a good place of better understanding over time, even if we don't start out maybe in the best place or the most accurate information.
We have one question online from Anne-Marie Catudal. I think you're still muted. Go. Oh. Anne-Marie? All right, we have another question from Scott Grandy.
Hi, thank you, Michael, for the question or for the presentation today. My question for you is, when I'm looking at these COWI guidelines, I can see how they work in a very simplistic model, in the sense that, if I have some C57s that are 6 weeks old and I'm going to inject them with something and then keep them for, say, a month and then sacrifice them and look at, say, immune cells or something like that. I understand that, but what happens when you have a protocol that, typically has like 10 transgenics, may have animal age categories that range from 3 to 20 months. Some of the mice are bred in-house. Some of them have been ordered from Charles River or Jack's. They have multiple experiments that range from 1 week up to months on end, and then they have multiple experimental groups. Like, how is something like that going to be tackled?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer to that is really, at this point, I don't know specifically. I think there's multiple things that can happen. So protocols can be simplified. I think this has come up a few times, this idea of these kind of omnibus protocols that get submitted and reviewed, and it is challenging. I understand that it's challenging to, as you said, track animals and capture all these different things that happen to them over maybe this really large protocol. So there might be it might be a best practice, or it might, I don't know what will happen in the future, but a way that protocols themselves become simpler and easier to understand and follow. The other thing is, I don't know exactly. I haven't, part of it will be like, when you sit down and kind of give it an honest try, where are the barriers? Like, what specifically is the challenge, and how can we solve that? Like, yeah.
If I can just jump in for a sec, I think one of the major barriers is going to be both the fact and I should have introduced myself. I'm the chair of the Animal Care Committee at Dalhousie University, as well as a researcher. And I see it as a two-phased issue, in the fact that, it's going to require significant more time from the researchers, who are already stretched for time. And it's going to require significant more time from the animal care committees that are typically also stressed for time and underfunded. So I guess my concern is, and this kind of ties into a second question that I have, is, without kind of a real implementation strategy from CACC, I'm not clear how we can be expected to make this work. I mean, based on what's come from CACC so far, like, it's not clear how we can even begin to implement this with some of our more complex protocols.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe, that's something that we'll take away from this. Like I don't have a specific answer for you right now, but I understand what you're saying, and that's something that we can take away to work on, or to work with institutions to develop some examples, or we can do something ideally then to help with that specific challenge, like over the next 6 years, that we can try and come up with some training or some kind of framework or something to help address this issue, these like really complicated protocols. But on the other thing I want to stress is that it's not a trivial thing to have like good oversight and understand like the welfare impact to the animals, that this is really important. And I understand that everyone is low on resources and everyone is low on time. But this is something that I think, the CCAC as an organization is kind of like worth the squeeze. Like it's really important to understand what the impacts to the animals are in a way that we can capture those effectively, and have kind of this more rigorous oversight of what's actually happening to these animals. That's something that's really important, and I don't want that to get lost.
No, and I 100% agree that animal welfare is of the utmost importance, and I'm not saying that we should sacrifice that. I guess what I'm trying to make clear today is that based on what I've seen from CACC so far, like I have no idea how to take this back to my committee, and the discussions within our own institution, we are not clear on how this can be implemented without and where's that fundamental shift going to happen with researchers in terms of whether they buy into it? Like, has CCAC talked to CIHR and some of the other granting agencies about how to potentially push this through their organizations?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not really sure. I'm not super privy to kind of the corporate discussions, but I will say that the CCAC, I think we are our next strategic plan is being developed and will come out within the next couple of years. So that's certainly something that we can at least look at and discuss, this idea of partnering with CIHR or some kind of approach with them. Like, sorry, go ahead, Pierre.
No, if I can interject, I mean, it's always been, this is Pierre at the CCAC. It always been the way of doing things, where I understand that you may need additional support and all that, but each institution comes up with what suits their practices, their establishments, and the way they're set up. We understand this will need time. That's why the implementation of this guidelines is 6 years. It's not 1 year like usually what the guidelines are. We're very, very cautious about bringing a solution and impose it on every institution, although they go through different reality. So we're very open at supporting the institutions with more training, making sure that people understand. But at the end of the day, processes are different from an institution to the other. So it's really not only hard, it could be very difficult when we just come with a plain solutions to apply evenly to every institution. So it's never the way we proceed. And I know sometimes institutions, they would like to have an answer, a quick answer for their institutions. But then it will vary from one institution to another how they should be organizing it. So, but there'll be more training for sure. There'll be more support. But for us to come up with a cookie cutter solution for all institutions and impose it, I'm not sure we would satisfy many people here.
No, thank you for that. And I guess the only last comment I'll make, and then I'll give it back to everyone else, is would you not be concerned about the lack of standardization in the implementation of this program then, so that you have different universities implementing different things?
It's the whole program functions like that. At the end, if we see the result and for us, it respects the guidelines, we're comfortable with it. How they come up to being in compliance, the solutions they brought to come to compliance that fits their institution, the way to get there, it's good. For us, as long as you comply with the guidelines at the end. We're not very stiff on the solution the institution comes with.
Okay, great. Thank you both very much.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think maybe I'll just expand a bit on that idea of consistency, and I think this is something that both the subcommittee and that we've talked a lot about, because the system requires judgments. It's not a math equation or something. There are going to be differences, especially between institutions and especially at the start. What we're hoping is, if we can start to tackle this kind of idea of consistency within institutions first, that's a good place to start. And then we can start looking at more broadly how between institutions are making judgments and help to improve standardization as well. But it's not going to be perfect. We recognize that different animal care committees, function and have different values and different cultures. And that's just a reality of the program here. And I think the other thing is important to remember that the categories of invasiveness were also not perfect and not perfectly standardized, even though they were more of a procedure-based list. When someone had to select a procedure, that wasn't explicitly written, or was doing a procedure that wasn't explicitly written, they still had to make a judgment whether it was a B or a C or whatever, and that there wasn't this kind of universal harmonization across Canada in that regard either. So it doesn't have to be perfect, and we know that things will ideally improve in that regard over time as well. So
we do have another question that kind of works very well with this. So is it because of the judgment call, is it better to err on the side of caution and overestimate the impact, or underestimate the impact at the first, at the perspective categorization?
Yeah. I think I think just logically it would be better to start with an overestimate, because that way it's always better if things go better than you predict they would, so that you may have too much monitoring in place, or you might have too many refinements. Is there such a thing as too many refinements? Probably not. But a way to kind of do things, predict things, maybe like, especially at the start, if you're uncertain, in a way that's maybe overestimating the welfare impacts, is probably kind of the more prudent approach, especially with the precautionary principle. And that it's also a great way to kind of feel good at the end that you've actually done things better than you thought you were going to, and that you can take that information again in this kind of iterative approach and move forward. I think would be my suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question here from Cecile Bacanal. Need to unmute.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't really want to raise my hand. I did it by mistake. But I'm gonna, since I'm on, I will talk. I see a lot of people have brought it up, the fact about it's complicated, and is there a way to make things more simple, and the cost of doing it versus the benefit. And I think that's both with the animal welfare assessments, we're being asked to do it on every single animals, and with 16 categories of invasiveness to look at. And so I think everybody needs to get together and really do things that make sense and that will really have a good impact on the welfare of the animals, because I think these are things sometimes are being developed without really the understanding and the knowledge of what's happening on the floor level in the research institutions. And so I think a better marriage, if you want, of you know, the CCAC development of the guidelines and really what's applicable and what's happening as a performance base on the floor level would be appreciated by a lot of people. So thank you.
We have Jennifer Moore.
Hi there. I wanted to kind of back up what the chair from Dalhousie was saying and ask for something that I would find extremely helpful to kind of alleviate some of those concerns that I'm feeling as well. If the explanation that you gave, Michael, on how these guidelines or several guidelines all overlap and work together, if CCAC could provide us with some suggestions on how to design an institutional program that meets all of these guidelines at once, that'd be really helpful in making these processes more efficient so that we don't end up with a separate process for every guideline, like you mentioned, which would be so much more time consuming for all the researchers and the ACCs.
Yeah. So I think maybe this is a bit of a combo of things, but I think that we hear this idea a lot, but as Pierre mentioned, it's really, really hard for CCAC to kind of put together something that we can give to institutions that will just work for everyone. There's so much variation across Canada, the 200-ish institutions that all function, uniquely. That is really hard for us to just kind of give a blanket approach. But what we can do is, especially kind of as this implementation phase goes on, is what we like to do is to bring on guest experts or people from institutions where they seem to have been able to figure out something that works for them, and bring those people in to give their kind of testimony or examples, and show others, and in this way that the community is kind of exchanging ideas, rather than the CCAC just trying to design something that will work for a bunch of institutions, right? Like I don't have any, like myself, any like context for how things work within individual institutions and the different processes and the different personnel that may work within your institution, et cetera. But I think that there is a good opportunity to kind of facilitate information sharing between those people who do have that expertise and who are able to kind of to start implementing these things within their institution. So I understand maybe that's a good compromise where people can get some help more from their peers rather than directly from the CCAC.
Right. That would be very much appreciated. I would love to attend one of those sessions and talk about different perspectives. And I think the CCAC perspective of having the big picture of how all these guidelines fit together would be really helpful for us at the institutions to hear and understand how all these things can overlap, so then we can think about how it makes sense to create overlapping processes in our institutions.
Yep, makes sense.
So we have another question about scientific procedures being one factor. However, if there are multiple procedures being done to one group of animals, should we be separating them out or just using the highest impact one? For example, blood being taken, surgery, behavior test afterwards, or should they all be done together?
Yeah, I think maybe this is also a bit tricky. I think they should be separated because it's important to understand, at least for the procedure, what the different impacts of those different procedures are, especially for an animal care committee reviewing a protocol. I think that would be really helpful when they look at kind of the list of experiences the animal is going to have. If each one was associated with an expected welfare impact score, I think that would be really helpful. In terms of kind of putting it into the report card, I guess it largely depends on a few things. Like if it's the same animals undergoing all the different procedures, then we also need to consider kind of the cumulative impact of those procedures, right? So maybe one of those procedures is a C, but once you start doing all four things, even if they're a bunch of Bs, like maybe the score needs to increase as well. So there's a bit of an overlap in that example in terms of the procedure and also the cumulative impact factor to think about for the animals. So again, like it's hard for me to give you like a specific answer in that situation, but I think in general, the more granular you can make it, it makes it easier to understand the different aspects of things that are happening to animals within your scientific activity. So in terms of reporting up, maybe I'll have to think about that specifically. But in terms of actually like thinking about the welfare impacts to the animals, I would suggest kind of giving each procedure its own score, and then thinking about whether or not there's any kind of cumulative impacts that a kind of a series of procedures would have on an individual animal.
Let me see. You mentioned several times that the ACC vets and protocol authors should come together to decide the COWI assigned to each item. Our institution does not currently have a process where the protocol authors would be consulting with the ACC while writing a protocol. What's your vision for how this collaboration would occur?
Yeah, so I think this could work differently depending on how things work, but in general, right, it's the protocol author who would write the protocol, fill all the information out, and submit it to the animal care committee. Presumably, with this new system, they could identify, expected welfare impacts on the various aspects of their protocol and put in, the letters as they see fit, and that this would be reviewed by the animal care committee. As normal as with all protocols, and everything would be reviewed by the animal care committee. And that I think what already happens is if the animal care committee has questions or uncertainties, they might reach out to that protocol author. They might try and schedule a meeting to resolve any kind of discrepancies or things they don't really fully understand, etc. And I think something similar it would just work the same. So if the protocol author filled out the protocol and signed all the letters, and the animal care committee was like, yep, this makes sense, we agree, that's fine. And that if there was like a strong disagreement or something, then we would have to look at these kind of more collaborative meetings or email chains or however your institution would kind of resolve those I guess differences of opinion between protocol authors and animal care committees as they do now. It would just be kind of part of the same process.
All right, we still have quite a few questions, but we are at our time. What we will do is take down these questions and we'll provide some answers, and then hopefully circulate it around or create an FAQ or something like that of the most frequently asked questions. If you have a pressing concern or question, please do feel free to reach out to any one of us or at ccac@ccac.ca, and we will also respond to your question that way. Thanks so much, Mike, and to all of you for joining us here today. We will be sending out a feedback form to you shortly, along with the link to the video of today's session. The form will help us improve your experience for the next event, which, speaking of that, will open registration for our fish welfare webinar next week. So that will be held at the end of November, and registration for that will be launched next week. So keep an eye out on your email for that as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.